Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this module we will discuss deficit and variability hypothesis. As we examine the relationship between language and society, we can take two strikingly different positions. One could be that the language of the middle class and elite is inherently superior to that of lower middle class and poor people, and that through their languages these classes would reproduce themselves. As it survives, the rich would remain rich and poor remains poor, since there is a circular relationship between their language styles and the kind of jobs they might get. Precisely, they suffer from a linguistic deficit, and hence they would also suffer from a societal deficit. The only hope for such a society may be some remedial intervention in language. So this is one stand according to the relationship between language and society, and the second stand is that of the variability hypothesis. So the variability hypothesis maintains that languages are not inherently rich or poor. On the other hand, they are all structurally equal. Linguists like Labov and Trudgill, who established the modern field of sociolinguistics, showed convincingly that language varieties are not rich or poor or deficit, they are just different. And those differences are not random but systematically organized. Now let us try to understand more about the deficit hypothesis. Deficit hypothesis was proposed by Basil Bernstein. Bernstein assumes a strong causal correlation between speech and socialization. He starts from the principle that speech habits of social groups in the low income brackets have peers in the low income bracket with little social influence, and this differs syntactically and semantically from those of other groups who have assured powerful and influential positions because of their material and intellectual privilege. Before Bernstein, Sapir and Worf also mentioned the strong influence of languages on our ideas. Worf found that many Indian languages are fundamentally different from Indo-European languages represented by English. According to him, such differences in structure correspond to different ways of perceiving world. For example, English sentence consists of two main parts, that is the subject and the predicate. The expression of any given situation is divided into an agent and an action. Some American Indian languages, for example Hopi, doesn't make this subject predicate division, that is a verb can exist or occur independent of a subject. In English, for example, we say a light flashed, while in Hopi the same meaning is expressed by one simple word, rehepi, which means flash occurred. The action of flashing and the agent of light are combined together. This shows that the two different languages, namely English and Hopi, are different for Worf in the sense that a subject-predicate language presents a bipolar worldview, whereas a language with subject-predicate combined sentence pattern presents a holistic and synthetic worldview. This difference in worldview, according to Worf, is not abstracted from the external world but preconditioned by different languages. Precisely what he says is people speaking a certain language will have to follow the logic of the language in their thinking. They will have different perception of the world because they speak different languages. Sapir and Worf hypothesis was unidirectional, and that it unidirectional, that it simply said that we construct our world according to the nature and structure of our language. Bernstein's assumption is that the speech of lower class is more limited in its competence than the speech of middle class. Bernstein in 1958 distinguished between a public language of the lower class and a formal language of middle class. So according to Bernstein, the speech of lower class is more limited and in its competence than the speech of middle class. He declared that the public language of lower class is a restricted code and the formal language as the elaborated speech code. Now we'll try to understand what restricted and elaborated speech code is. Bernstein in 1971 coined the terms elaborated and restricted codes. Since then, these terms have been extensively used in educational and language domain, particularly to discredit the speech of the marginalized section of society and to institute remedial courses for the lower middle class and poor. So since the language variety spoken by the lower middle class is apparently restricted, they were given remedial courses and classes in that particular language. Though science of language has long abandoned these terms, criticizing them on solid theoretical and empirical grounds, they continue to be in vogue in several educational circles. The linguistic deficit hypothesis holds that lower class children tend to learn only restricted code, whereas middle class children learn both restricted and elaborated codes. However, this proposal has been rejected by many prominent sociolinguists. Let's now look at an example to understand the concept of restricted and elaborated code. So suppose there's an accident and two 15-year-olds called, let's call them A and B, happen to be there and they saw the accident. So now they get into different situations where they have wished to describe the accident to the interlocutor. A may describe, the person A may describe the accident assuming that the listener was also there and provide a very brief description of what happened. And he or she, according to Bernstein, will have a restricted code. His or her speech will consist of short, simple sentences without any complex sentences involving subordinate clauses. However, the person B will not make any such assumptions and provide an explicit and detailed description of the accident. And he or she is said to have an elaborated code, that is, their speech will contain complex noun phrases with adjectives and relative clauses, and sentences will often be complex containing subordinate clauses. So the major distinction between restricted and elaborated code was that a person who uses a restricted code will have short, simple sentences and they will not use any complex sentences involving subordinate clauses. On the contrary, a person who uses elaborated code has access to, they use complex sentences with subordinate clauses and their speech will contain complex noun phrases with adjectives and relative clauses and all that. So precisely in restricted code, speech consists of short, simple sentences without any complex sentences involving subordinate clauses, and in elaborated code, speech will contain complex noun phrases. The theory behind Bernstein's proposal is that the different speech styles originate in different psychological and social experience of their speakers. So here by experience, experience is being determined by membership of a particular social class. So basically what the restricted code and elaborated code is assigned to a particular social class, that is the lower class uses restricted code and the upper class uses elaborated code. If we examine Wolff's and Bernstein's ideas, their theory is essentially based on the assumption that different linguistic forms produce different social experience. Wolff observed that these differences are seen chiefly in different language communities, but Bernstein transferred this observation to social barriers between classes within a society. Thus, Wolff's thesis is unilateral and Bernstein's thesis is a bit circular. Both theories deal with the demonstration of a dependency relationship between language and thought on the one hand and language and social structure on the other hand. So, Bernstein believes that the speech of the middle class is superior to that of the lower class in explicitness, grammatical correctness and capacity of logical analysis regardless of measured intelligence. So, according to Bernstein, the upper class people who use the elaborated code has their speech is explicit and they have grammatical correctness in their speech, and it has more clarity and logically it is way better than people who use restricted code. A speaker is employing an elaborated speech code when he can make extensive use of the structural possibilities of linguistic material, expressing himself in such a way that his verbal behavior clearly identifies him as belonging to the middle class. Similarly, a speaker is employing a restricted speech code when he uses part of his structural linguistic possibilities and cannot correctly verbalize complex trains of thoughts of logical relationship. So, according to Bernstein, a speaker uses restricted speech code when he only has a when he only uses partial structural linguistic possibilities. Now we will discuss the critique Bernstein received on his hypothesis of restricted code and elaborated code. The deficit hypothesis proposed by Bernstein produced a heated debate, particularly among former linguists and sociolinguists as well. The proposal that the speech of the children was speech of the poor children was deficit, and the argument that their speech was responsible for their poverty was criticized on both theoretical and empirical grounds. Linguists led by William Labov said that working class speech is merely different from middle class speech and is not inferior to it. And hence he also continued to say that working class children in school are penalized not only for being different and not for being incompetent or inferior. Labov succeeded in showing on empirical grounds that the so-called stigmatized vernacular of the black people was as systematic as the so-called standard American English. In 1979, a federal court in Michigan asked Labov whether black English vernacular should be stigmatized as a slang, or it was just a distorted version of standard American English. And Labov convinced the court that Black English vernacular was a rule governed, and the Black English vernacular is as systematic as any other variety of English at all levels of language, including sound, words, sentences, and discourse. Black English vernacular, according to Labov, was a language in its own right, and he argued that BEV should be considered as strength of black children and recognized as such in the education system. So he asked for the acceptance of Black English vernacular and also to introduce Black English vernacular into the education system of the black children. He also argued that Black English vernacular would only facilitate rather than hinder the acquisition of other languages. This demonstration was a major breakthrough in sociolinguistics and questioned the deficit hypothesis proposed by Bernstein. Labov also took up a study of the American departmental stores to prove his point, and this study became a prelude to his landmark work in sociolinguistics in 1966. He took 3 stores: Saks, which is located in a high fashionable area, and it was a very prestigious store. And next was Macy's, which was in the middle range in terms of prices and advertising and expenditure. And the third store, Klein, was the least prestigious of the 3. The stores were well defined in terms of their social stratification, and it was safe to assume that the customers from different strata of society would normally visit them. In order to study the pronunciation of R by the employees of the 3 departmental stores, Labov asked questions which should elicit the lexical items 4th floor. So he wanted to elicit the sound R, and he made the informants say the words 4th floor so that it has R twice, 4th and floor. The interviewers would ask the salesperson, excuse me, where are the women's shoes? The casual spontaneous answer would be 4th floor. He would then lean forward and ask again, sorry, what did you say? Pretending that what the salesperson had said earlier was not clear enough for him. Now when he asks the same question again, the informant says a more formal 4th floor, and a formal answer is elicited, a formal data is elicited. Each employee thus could pronounce post-vocalic R 4 times, that is twice each in 4th floor. This kind of data was collected from 264 persons, 68 from Saks, 125 from Macy's, and 71 from Klein's. The results illustrated that the variable R in New York City was stratified by class. So Saks employees used the sound R 62% of the time, and the Macy's employees used it 51%, and the Klein's employees used it only for 20%. Different use of R was thus an integral part of the linguistic structure of New York speech community. The pronunciation of R depended on this on the social class membership of the employees. That is, those with higher socioeconomic status pronounced R more frequently than that of the lower socioeconomic status. So in all the stores, R appeared more frequently in the final as opposed to the post-vocalic position. It appeared more frequently in the formal style than the casual style, and it also showed systematic variation in terms of race, as in black versus white, and also social classes. It is thus proof that speech codes are different and not deficit. The variety spoken by a particular class of people is not in any way less than the other. They just remain to be different, and they are not inferior or superior to any other variety of language. And reasons for poverty were elsewhere in the socio-political forces of a given society and not in one's language. So, Bernstein proposed that the poor remains poor because the poor uses the restricted code, and Labov is now saying that the reasons for poverty is elsewhere in the socio-political forces of a given society and not in one's language. It is also important to note that the so-called elaborated code was not universalistic. Nor the restricted code is particularistic or specific. Labov argues that the so-called elaborated code often tends to be redundant and stylistic, whereas the so-called restricted code may show qualities of being abstract, logical and precise. So, in this module we discussed the deficit hypothesis as proposed by Bernstein. He proposed that the middle class uses an elaborated code which is more grammatical and abstract and logical, while the lower class uses a restricted code that is confined to the immediate surroundings and is full of incomplete sentences. And he also said that the people who use the restricted code lacks abstraction and their speech is often illogical. So now we also discussed Labov's theory of social stratification, and he proves that Bernstein's theory of restricted code and elaborated code is not it does not have a scientific or empirical basis. So, Labov's social stratification experiment says that language of the poor and downtrodden was as systematic and logical as the language of any speech community. So, just because you belong to a lower class, your speech is not restricted, and just because you belong to the middle class or upper class, your speech is not in any way superior. We also discussed Labov's social stratification experiment and how he proved that the language of the poor and downtrodden was as systematic and logical as the language of any speech community. Labov also focused on vernacular. Traditionally, the term vernacular is used in a very stigmatized sense. So, it is considered, it is seen to be a stigmatized language used by illiterates or uncultured. As opposed to the literary and national standard, it is referred to the non-standard variety or the local variety of a language. Labov, however, gave a very different connotation to the term vernacular, and according to Labov, vernacular speech is something that comes when you're least conscious about it. And according to him, it was the most informal speech of an individual, that is a speech that is produced with the least amount of attention paid to it. And so To conclude, in this module we discuss about various deficit hypothesis and Labov social stratification. We have also seen that how Bernstein divided the divided language and named them elaborated code and restricted code just on the basis of social class. And I hope this video helped you in understanding the terms deficit hypothesis, vernacular, and also about Labov's experiment on social stratification. Thank you.